The earliest evidence of farming in the subcontinent was thought to have come from Balochistan in the northwest region, but new discoveries point to the fact that you might have had farming arising independently across the region. You find a lot of animal remains across central Indian sites, including cattle, deer, goats, and even horses. Agriculture in South India likely began later because the environment here was more conducive to hunting-gathering lifestyles. At the end of the Ice Age, you had changing conditions that forced migrations into areas surrounding rivers where settlements then emerged. This happened in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, and in northwest India. The increased pressure on resources likely resulted in the emergence of complex socio-political systems. So you then had the Sumerian states rising in Mesopotamia, kingdoms coming up across the Nile, and in the northwest India, you had settlements coming up around the Indus and the Ghaggar. Now, the Ghaggar is a river that Sanyal identifies with the Saraswati, which was originally thought to have been a mythological river. Now, there has been evidence that has shown that the Ghaggar was indeed an actual river that disappeared some time back, but at its height would have been even larger than the Indus, with the Yamuna and the Satluj flowing into it. The Harappan civilization was situated around the Indus and the Saraswati rivers. The earliest phase of settlements is dated back to around 7,000 years ago, though the mature Harappan phase is dated to about 2600 BCE. This is when you have most of your big cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa and Dholivara come up. It's interesting because this is also the time that the Saraswati starts drying up, and tectonic plate movements take the Yamuna and Satluj away from the river. Around 2000 BCE, the late Harappan phase settles in, and most of the large settlements start dying out. So, the Harappan civilization at the height of its power would have extended all the way from western UP in modern day India to the port of Gwadar in modern day Iran. Now, Dholavira was one of the most important cities in the entire civilization because it connected the Gulf of Khambat and by extension the Arabian Sea to the Ghaggar. There's evidence of a lot of external trade having taken place with different parts of the Middle East and the Makran coast. Harappan objects have been found across this entire Persian Gulf continuum, and Harappan weights and measures were also uniform throughout the region. Harappan cities flourished till about 2000 years ago, after which changing conditions forced the ancestral North Indian populations to move in a southeasterly direction, and your ancestral South Indian populations to move in a northern direction. Now, these populations underwent a great mixing or churning, and most of Indians today bear a genetic marker of this, which shatters the idea of there having been a pure North Indian or a pure South Indian population. In around 100 AD, you see evidence of this mixing stop, and there are rigid caste hierarchies that are imposed, though we don't really know why this happened. Technology spread rapidly across the subcontinent at this time, and though South India missed out on the Bronze Age, South Indian technologies led the Iron Age in the subcontinent. So, Sanyal identifies the Harappans as the people of the Vedas, and in doing so counters a previously prevalent belief that the Vedas were composed by incoming or invading Aryans. To do this, he offers evidence in the form of the dating of the texts, and also offers evidence from within the texts themselves, and eventually claims that the Vedic people were a subset of the Harappans. So, if there wasn't an Aryan invasion, what explains the links between the Central Asian populations and the Vedic populations? Now, one possibility is that your Central Asian populations were descendants of the Parsu tribes, and there's evidence linking them to the Sapta Sindhu region. Another is that they were just a larger part of the Indo-Iranian continuum that existed, which then resulted in there being some similarities between the two. The collapse of Bronze Age empires resulted in a decline in this Indo-Iranian continuum, but when you look at Africa over here, you had Egypt trading a lot with Yemen, Eritrea and Oman in items like gold, ivory, frankincense. And these early interactions between Egypt and Yemen are what gave rise to the legend of King Solomon, which later became the founding myth of Ethiopia. Meanwhile, Southeast Asian populations were undergoing great migrations because of the end of the Ice Age. You had two groups emerge here. One were the Austronesians and the second were the Austroasiatics. The Austronesians are the ancestors of what you would today call the Filipinos, Indonesians and Malays, while the Austroasiatics are the ancestors of populations like the Vietnamese, the Khmers and the Thais. The Austroasiatics also moved across land a great deal, and in fact came all the way to northeast India, where you see them being the ancestors of different tribes like the Khasis and the Santals. Iron implements were used across the subcontinent by around 1300 BCE, though there's evidence to show that they might have actually been developed sometime earlier. The Iron Age was also a time of great change in the subcontinent, and it's also the time when you have texts like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana being composed. There were two major roads that ran across the subcontinent at this time. One was the Uttara Path, which ran from the east to the west, and the Dakshin Path, which went from the north to the south. There was a maritime boom that occurred around 800 BCE, which was centered around Kalinga in modern day Odisha. Transoceanic journeys weren't really possible at this time, so most maritime activity was conducted by traveling along the coast. Now, you had a group which travelled from Kalinga down south and settled in Sri Lanka, likely replacing the native inhabitants of this place. Now, these native inhabitants would have found their own way there, while Sri Lanka was still attached to the Indian mainland. The settlers from Kalinga replaced these populations and became known as the Sinhalese. And the Sri Lankan epic, the Mahavamsa, tells the myth of their foundation by Vijaya, a prince who was banished from Bengal. So, on the western front, you find stories of India coming from the writings of Herodotus. Now, his writings were a mix of fact and fiction, and in them you see India depicted as a land of great exoticism and great riches, and also as the easternmost land in the world. Now, he writes of maritime expeditions down the Red Sea to India that originated in Egypt, and he also writes of a canal that connected the Red Sea to the Nile, which was perhaps some ancient version of the Suez Canal. Also, importantly, there's some evidence in his text that suggests that the Phoenicians might have indeed rounded the Cape of Good Hope around this time, millennia before Vasco da Gama and the Portuguese did. Now, overland, this was a time when Alexander was marching eastwards and coming in conflict with the Persians. Interestingly, in their conflicts with Alexander, the Persians are said to have used Indian cavalry regiments. After his defeat of the Persians, we all know of Alexander's arrival into India and of his subsequent turning back following the rebellion by his troops. What is less well known, though, is that part of his troops tried to return back to the Mediterranean by sailing down the Indus. Now, this was because of a popular confusion that existed between the lower parts of the Indus and the upper parts of the Nile. So, the Mauryas were the rising dynasty in the subcontinent at the time of Alexander's invasion, and the Mauryan ruler that we know the most of is Ashoka. Sanyal is actually challenging most of the ideas that you have of Ashoka so far, because most narratives of Ashoka hold that he was an extremely violent person in his early days, but after the brutality of the Kalinga war, he turned towards Buddhism and towards spreading peace. Now, what Sanyal is saying is that his turn towards Buddhism actually happened much before the Kalinga war and was a political tool, and he didn't in fact ever turn completely non-violent. The evidence he presents for this is that most of his messages of peace are found on rock edicts which were far away from his empire and therefore unverifiable. Also, there was the fact that he never apologized to the people he captured during the Kalinga war, and the Buddhist text, the Ashoka Vandana, tells us of genocides that he committed even after the Kalinga war. Now, after Ashoka's death, the empire underwent a lot of instability, and you had a lot of smaller kingdoms breaking away at this time. One of these kingdoms was the kingdom of Kalinga, which rebelled and regained their throne under Kharavela, who headed the Chedi clan in 193 BCE. Under him, they strengthened their borders and in fact fought the Indo-Greeks at Magadh on the invitation of the Mauryans, who by this time were unable to defend themselves.